Hello, Lesley. I'm so excited to have you here today. I've been looking forward to meeting you and talking to you, especially about your new book that I've just been reading on my holiday away. And yeah, I'd just like you to introduce yourself so people know what I'm talking to today.
Oh, thank you, Veronique. And I've been looking forward to our conversation as well. So, I'm Lesley Thomas. I'm the founder of the Money Confidence Academy. I'm the host of the Let's Talk Money and More podcast. And more recently, the number one best-selling author of Parents, Let's Talk Money and More. And what I do essentially is help people to get more confident in their relationship with money so that they have the ability to pass that same money confidence on to their children, onto the next generation.
I love that. And I love in your book, I think your tagline was something like, if you don't talk to your kids about money, someone else will, or
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And that is the thing. We are in a time when we all have access to so much information online. But just because we have access to information online doesn't mean it's good information. And the likes of TikTok, for example, whilst there are people providing really sound information and advice, there are also people on there that are providing absolute rubbish when it comes to information. And in my book, I wanted to make it very, very clear that our teenagers actually want to learn from us, their parents. They don't want to learn from the platforms. But if we're not, and they don't want to learn from their friends or their peers either, because just because your friends tell you something, it doesn't mean they've got it right either. So, as parents, I firmly believe it is our job to talk to our children about money, but it doesn't need to be complicated. We don't need to be financial experts. We just have to have the confidence to sit down and ask them what they want to know. And if we don't know the answer, we just tell them, I don't know, but we can find out together because that's a real opportunity to bond. Because, teenage years are usually when our children are starting to pull away from us. But actually, having that conversation around money allows us to bond and come together.
I love that. The interesting thing is in my work, so as a coach for parents, I love talking openly about alcohol, sex, drugs, anything, intimacies, yeah, all these things. And when I was reading your book, I was like, wow, I can do this in everything, but I can't do it with the money. And I have learned it from my parents to talk about sex. I was brought up religious, so very strict, but somehow I managed to get to a point. Well, I always think, how would I have wanted my parents to talk to me? So I do that. But money-wise, I wasn't able to do this. So your book really, and what I love about it really is so non-judgmental, which is beautiful because if we
Mhm.
judge, we close off. But it just made me realize and really want to learn because I mean, especially reading your book, but I feel like there's so much lacking there, but it's so emotionally loaded, isn't it? It has so much to do with how we were brought up and what emotions our parents were giving us attached to money.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. We attach so much of our self-worth, our own view of our place and position in the world around money. Our own self-value is often so linked to how much we have in our bank account or how much we don't have in our bank account. And we rank ourselves subconsciously very often around that. Because I've had so many people say to me, you say in your book that our relationship with money is formed by the age of 7. How can that be when we've had such little experience of money? Because our relationship with money is not formed on the basis of us managing money. It's formed on the basis of what we saw and heard from our parents with regards to money. And that forms our money story. And we take that through with us through our entire lives, even when that money story that was relevant to our parents may have been relevant to what we experienced in our childhood, but the experience we're having as adults is no longer of relevance. And I often say, as young children, we believed in so many things. We believed in Father Christmas, we believed in the Tooth Fairy, we believed in the Easter Bunny. But at a certain point, we let those things go. But we actually carry on holding on to our money story, even though that is no longer a relevant part of our lives. And once we realize we can change our money story, that almost instantly sets people free. Oh, I no longer have to believe I'm bad with money, or people who have money are bad people, or people who don't have money are not worthy of having money, or I have to work really, really hard in order to have enough. Once we start to realize we can change that story, then the effect it can have on us is instantaneous or can be instantaneous. But actually, when we realize that as parents, we are the authors of our children's money story, that is what very often drives us into action. What? My limiting beliefs around money and passing on to my children. How's that happening? It's happening because they are watching you, they're listening to you, they're seeing your reaction, and that they are soaking up like sponges. And that is where the awareness really needs to be placed. We think we're behaving and acting in a certain way. Our children are very, very intuitive. They're taking it on board. They are reading the messages. They may be misreading the messages, but they're taking that on as their money story.
Yeah. Oh God. I mean, there's so much to talk about. So I guess also our generation of parents. My parents were post-war, so that been such a different time. And when I was reading a book, I thought, oh, why have I never been told about savings and all these things you explain? And I thought, well, they were just growing up. There weren't that many options in those days, and maybe saving in those days would bring much better interest than it does nowadays. But I was really shamed. There was so much shame around money and emotional blackmail, and it's very hard to get yourself out of that. But also, what I realized is that I am surrounded by people, and there's some people who are wealthy, and I can tell how their money mindset is so positive. So they will make money because they haven't got an issue with it, and other people who really struggle. And everyone goes through kind of the money blogs and the manifestation. But actually, reading your book, I thought it's much more simple than that. Why don't I sit down and inform myself about all these things I'm realizing I'm lacking? I was listening to your podcast. I was learning about credit cards that my, first credit score, so my maybe
Yeah,
18-year-old. And I thought, this is actually what gives me power, not, I mean, these emotional things, but it helps me to get over my emotional stuff, be aware of it, and then go, I want to learn so I can actually pass it on. And I think it's often the not knowing that makes us feel we have no control, or these emotions are too strong and we pass the
absolutely.
negative on to our children.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is very often why parents won't talk to their children about money, because we get to a certain point in our life when we think, I should know this stuff. And if I don't know this stuff, my child is going to think less of me because I can't give them the answer, or the answer I give them is incomplete, or I just say to them, I don't know. And that brings up so many emotions for us that we stay away from those topics, of that
Mm.
particular topic. But the truth is, you were probably the same as me. I wasn't taught about money at school. If you're not taught about something, how are you expected to know about it? So the sooner that we actually admit, I don't know about that. So if our child comes home from school and they ask us about Pythagoras's theorem, for example, we don't go, I've got to go and make dinner. Really sorry, can't talk to you about that. We go, my God, what? Pythagoras is what? And we're quite happy to kind of go off and work with them to find out what that actually is. we need to take exactly the same approach when it comes to money, particularly as money has changed so much since you and I were children. Most things were paid for by cash or checkbook when we were younger. It was pound coins, and notes of money, basically. These days, it's a ping of a phone or a ping of a card. Digital wallets. The ability to hand over money in lots of shops now has gone because most shops don't want to take our cash. So we need to have that conversation that says to our children, do you know, since I was a child, money is so different these days that I'm learning about it as much as you are. But actually, that's not only admitting to our children that we don't know everything, because that's actually giving them permission as well to go, well, do you know? I don't know everything either. Because if we create an environment at home where our children think by the time you get to a certain age, you should know everything, then we're setting them up to fail and we're discouraging them from being curious. And that is something all adults should remain being throughout their lives is curious. I never want to think I know everything. I never want to have a day that's not a school day where I'm learning something. So why do we think about money in terms of, I don't know the answer. I'm going to shy away from talking about that topic. I'm not going to open up the conversation with regards to talking about our children's goals and aspirations and what they want to save for and what the family budget looks like. And we want to go on holiday. Where should we go? How much is it going to cost? What are we going to save? What are we going to give up in order to be able to do that? And there's lots of little things that we can do, and the book obviously goes into this in more detail, that takes that conversation, and the conversation starts to become one that moves our child forward with confidence. So it's okay for me to ask you about that electricity bill and what it means. So it's okay for me to ask you how much we spend on groceries each week, or to ask you how much your mortgage is, how much the house is worth. All of those things, we should be confidently having those conversations because they are more life-changing than actually knowing what Pythagoras' theorem actually is.
And we do have this conversation with everything else about the
Yeah.
alcohol, the things, all the things that they meet in their lives earlier. We would have the conversation, but we don't talk about money. And it's interesting also. I mean, it's from my personal experience, well, it's such a dilemma as well as parents. So I wish I'd seen your book a few years back when my kids were younger because I love the idea of the family budget. I'm not sure how I can introduce that now with a 14 and 18-year-old, but I've already started conversations with them, which I really love. But also seeing an 18-year-old trying to buy a car. So you have the situations where, we just went half with our child. So he paid some, we paid some of it. But then you see kids who they get an almost new car paid by the parents, and a week later it's scratched. Oh, my daddy is going to pay for it. You see the other extreme as well, where you go like, wow, do I really want to be that kind of parent? What kind of parent do I want to be? How much, things like pocket money. We used to give our kids pocket money, but I never knew, should I give pocket money? Should I pay for chores? I often, as much as I knew in lots of other areas of parenting what I wanted, this was always an area I didn't know what to think and what to do and how to do it.
Yeah. And there is a big debate with regards to, do you give your children pocket money in return for chores? And my honest answer is you absolutely do, because children need to understand the value of money and they need to understand the value of their time and what they are doing in order to earn that money. Because it's only when they actually see the value do they suddenly go, hang on, I had to make my bed for a week in order to get that amount of money at the end of the week. And now my mum is saying I have to use that money to buy X. Okay, well, I know it took me that long. Do I really want to buy X now, or would I prefer to save that money and buy something bigger because I know we're going on holiday in 2 months' time? If they think they can just keep coming to you, I want X, we're going away, I need Y, they don't place any value on that money, and they don't place any value on their time, because what we're helping them to do is to value themselves and to understand wants and needs. So for me, I have never ever had any problem in saying to my children, right, you take it in turns each day to empty the dishwasher, you make your bed as a minimum, and you take it in turns to take the recycling out. That was kind of a minimum they had to do from a relatively young age. I didn't necessarily then say, and at the end of the month, I'm going to pay you, but they understood that was the bargain, basically. Because I think if we don't do that, at what point do we introduce the cost of things, the value of their time, the value exchange of, I want this, and mum or dad saying, okay, you want that. How are we as a family going to go about saving for that? Or how are you going to go about saving that? Because when they reach the age of, 18 and legally are adults, and I say legally, because as you will know, Veronique, particularly for boys, their brains are not fully formed until they're 26, 27. So just because somebody in government decided all those years ago the legal age was 16, was 18, they don't suddenly wake up as an adult at
Yeah,
18. So
exactly.
how can we expect them to make good decisions about money, about budgeting, about wants and needs, if we're not teaching them those good money habits from a younger age? So it's not about, I can't expect my child to do. Well, if you don't help them to understand the value of their time, the value of money, then actually they're going to get to an age when they're not really capable of making those decisions in the same safe way as they would do if we help them to do that when they're younger.
Yeah. That's interesting. And also, you talk about in your book, you talk a lot about the immediate gratification or delayed gratification, which I
Yeah.
think is such an important thing, especially nowadays, where everything by the click of a button, you can have it the next day. And that's something our children almost don't learn anymore. And that's so important, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's not just they don't learn anymore. Actually, the way gaming companies, etc., are set up, it is literally that click. V-Bucks, those games where they can buy V-Bucks. That children are getting those games around 3 or 4 years of age. So they are thinking, I can press that button and I get more money, not realizing that actually you're pressing that button, and it's costing somebody something.
Yeah.
Probably the parents most likely. So if we don't encourage them to actually go, do you really want that? And if so, that's going to be at the cost of, I'm taking £2 out of your piggy bank, or I'm taking £5 out of your allowance, whatever it might be, then they're constantly going to be in a cycle of thinking, I want, I want, I want, rather than making the
Mm.
kinds of thought processes that says, well, I want that. I've got that much, but if I have that, then I'm not really going to have that amount left in order to be able to do something else. We
Yeah.
need our children to be thinking about all their choices. Do I want more sweets? Do I want to go out to play with that particular friend? Do I want to spend that amount of money? It's all connected, because how we do money is how we do everything. And I think that is really, really important to understand, that if our child is making poor choices about money, then that is going to extend into them making poor choices about other things as well.
Yeah. I remember my son being younger and we were at a cash point and I was taking out money and he said, "So who is standing on the other side giving you that money?" It's so hard to understand. It's so hard to explain. But I have now an 18-year-old who knows actually so much more than me about money. It's just quite interesting. And it's almost impossible to keep up, when once you go down the Bitcoin road or anything like that. But it's almost like, and I think that's the beauty of nowadays, but also obviously the danger with the internet, but they do know so much. And I think we also have to give them credit to a certain extent for what they know. So I will have conversations where I go like, okay, I am feeling like I'm a student and I've got a teacher in front of me. I just have to trust what my child learns is correct, and it's safe. I see a
But
lot of
I would caution there though to actually sanity check it with them because, just as the book says, if you're not talking to your teen
yeah,
about it, who is? Just because they sound very eloquent in their
yeah,
knowledge doesn't mean they've imparted that knowledge
yeah,
correctly. And let me give you a really good example. It's a very funny example, and it's not age relevant to your 18-year-old, but it
yeah,
that's what I want to say quite well. When my eldest son was not about 9, he said to me one night, he said, "Mum, I now know what sex is." I thought, "Oh, okay, we're going to have that conversation." I said, "Okay, so tell me what sex is, just so, I can make sure, you've got the right idea and you've got any questions." He said, "It's okay, Mum. Charlie told me sex is when you strip off, you take all your clothes off, and you run around the football pitch." No, Adam, that's not sex. That's streaking. And that gives a really good example of just because our child thinks they know something, because a friend, a trusted friend, has told them what it is, it doesn't necessarily mean it is correct. So it is always worth saying, so where did you get that information from then? How do you know that that is correct? Because we all like to be told I'm going to buy Bitcoin and I'm going to be a multimillionaire story. But actually, actually, not even for every Bitcoin millionaire, there's far more people who've been stung by
yeah.
Bitcoin than have been successful with Bitcoin. So I would always caution,
Of
totally
course.
agree with you, that our children very often do understand a lot of things we don't necessarily, but just get them to be a little bit cautious
Yeah.
because, some of the influencers are very good. I've heard a story, for example, very, very recently. There is a scam going on currently, and it's going on in one of the counties around me, Hampshire, I believe. And older teenagers at college are being targeted by people online wanting to help them to become traders, basically. Um, and all they have to do is invest £300 of money and they'll be shown how to trade. So they invest their £300 and lo and behold, it does really well. And they double their money and they get really excited. And all of a sudden, they start losing money. And then they make a little bit back, and that gives them their confidence again. And then they start to lose more until they've lost it all, and they take more money and they reinvest because they've been caught in a scam where they know how to make older teenagers, young people have that sense of, hey, I've got this skill, I know what I'm doing. They create an environment in which they have a few good wins, and then all of a sudden the rug is pulled from underneath them, and they end up losing a lot more money, and they don't know where to go because they've not had the conversation with their parents about it. So we do have to be careful that whilst money has changed a lot since we were younger, there are far more scams and there are far more ways to scam people than there were when we were younger.
Yeah, but I do find it's very difficult, even if you try to check in, it's almost impossible to keep up, isn't it?
Yeah,
Sometimes
I
with the
agree.
difference. And what I find a real problem for young people as well, and I think this might be particular hitting boys, I think, from what I hear, is also that there is no ceiling anymore. When we used to go to work, your ambition was you go higher up in your company, you become senior position, or you change to a better company, your salary gets better. But now with all the, like you say, the influencers, it's all about making millions, become millionaires. There is just no ceiling. And I think our kids haven't grown up with this idea of one step at a time. It's just like massive steps, and the only way you can be successful if you have these big numbers. And I think a lot of young people, especially boys, get really lost in those, in that idea, and often they lose kind of the stepping stones, the idea of stepping stones to getting there, but also their self-motivation, because they get so overwhelmed and
Yeah.
feel so like failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've just hit the nail on the head there because, again, when we were younger, becoming a millionaire at 60 or a millionaire at 50, that was the kind of milestones you read about, in the paper, etc. Whereas now with influencers, you hear about them becoming multi-millionaires, late teens, early 20s, the number of multi-millionaires under 30, etc. That we have created an environment where you are expected to hit, you have the expectation that you will hit milestones far earlier than we ever anticipated was going to be possible for our generation, if at all
Yeah.
possible for our generation. And then, because we're attaching, our children are attaching so much of their self-worth and self-value to that artificial number, because we have to remember how people are showing up online doesn't mean, first of all, it's the reality, of their situation. But also, I give talks in schools, very, very regularly. And I gave a talk in a private school just before the summer. And we were talking about how, even when you have money, you can actually lose it all if you don't manage it well. And I talked about Boris Becker because he was 17 when he first won Wimbledon, which was the same age as the majority of the students in the school. He lost his money because, he was not managing it effectively with the finance manager that was looking after him at the time. There's been, a number of Tori Spelling who came from one of America's biggest TV families, billionaires. She ended up hugely, in debt. So just because the impression is they have money, therefore they have success, no, that is not the case. But also at the other end of the scale, as you're talking about there, we are in a current situation where the media is constantly saying that, young people, are not ever going to be able to get on the housing ladder because houses are so expensive and the jobs market is in disarray. And lots of young people, particularly boys, as you've said, are starting to have that sense of hopelessness. I am never going to have what my parents had, so what's the point? I've applied for X number of jobs, but there's zero contract, meaning I'm never ever going to have security when it comes to my money. So the messaging that we're getting from the media, the fact that most schools don't talk about money, and not just in the sense of the practicalities around money. As you'll know from my book talks about the practicalities, but actually, the mindset piece is just as important. Because if you don't have those two elements, the practical side, the mindset, and then the big piece on top, the self-trust to do something with that information, then you're just going to be left in this doom cycle. And right now, our young people are in a situation. So we talked earlier on about the importance of pocket money, etc. When I was 16, I had two part-time jobs through choice. I worked in Tesco's after school on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I worked in Boots on a Saturday. That was the best education I could have had in terms of learning to manage my money. Trying to get a part-time job now as a 16 or 17-year-old is virtually impossible. Why? Unfortunately, because of the increase to national insurance that was put in place last November, employers are now saying, why am I going to pay for an inexperienced 16 or 17-year-old when I now have to pay national insurance? Whereas when we were younger, employers didn't have to pay national insurance until we were earning over 10, 12,000 pounds. So all of a sudden we've created an environment where young people are not able to get the skills of having a part-time job, not able to get the customer service experience, and more crucially, not able to get the experience of managing money. So if there's ever been a time where it's more important to talk to our children about money, now is that time.
And also these life skills that's come with any jobs like that. I think kids are
Exactly.
in more and more life practical skills, and everything is online and everything is theoretical. And I think it's a really good skill. I
Yeah,
totally
agree.
agree. And I did holiday jobs from a younger age, and yet I still thinking about this. I did holiday jobs from the age of 16. We weren't allowed earlier in Belgium, and every summer I would make my money. I often work on weekends. I still didn't learn to do with money because I hadn't got the basis from home.
Yeah,
And I think that really hit hard when I read your book, because that's where we need to start, because there has to be a conversation, because you can have the money, but you can still really be bad at handling it. And when I listened to your story about what got you started, I'm so thankful that in Belgium we weren't allowed to have these credit cards like here in England. When I moved to
yeah,
England 20 years ago, I was like, what? You had all this money? I would have gone down I mean, it would have been really horrible for me. Belgium was
yeah,
super strict. We couldn't have it. Thank God for me, because it would have been my
yeah.
downfall.
Yeah. And I think that, that is the issue because, again, coming back to the whole thing, when a child hits 18, goes off, to university, the banks are clamoring to give them, as they did me, a credit card because it creates that habit then, doesn't it, of I haven't got the money, but actually I have because I've got my piece of plastic. I can go off and I can buy whatever, and all I need to pay back is this tiny amount of money each month, not realizing that tiny amount of money you're paying back is not, doing anything than it's just covering the interest and a tiny bit of the capital. So that debt is just growing and growing, and your monthly amount is increasing and increasing. But because, my parents did not talk to me about credit cards. Now, in fairness to them, I did see my dad paying off his credit card every single month without fail, the total amount. But I didn't understand what he was doing and why he was doing it. And I think if he'd explained that to me, and it's not his fault, it's totally on me, if he'd explained it to me, I would have probably been a little bit wiser and gone, Lesley, do you really need to be going to Marks and Spencer's as a student and doing your shopping there, putting it on your credit card? So how long it took me, to pay back for that loaf of bread, that tin of beans, or whatever it might have been, because of the amount of interest, etc., goodness
Mm.
knows. But our country is set up to make access to debt. We call it credit, it's debt. To make
Yeah.
access to debt very, very easy. And we wonder why households have tens of thousands of
Mm.
pounds of debt that they're struggling to pay back. It's because we haven't given them the tools to understand what it is, how to manage it, how to avoid it in the first place, but what to do when they get into trouble, as well, because nobody wants to talk about money. We want to push it under the carpet and let somebody else deal with it. Why? Let's not do that. Let's have an open conversation. Let's make it much easier for people to understand the importance of understanding the basics around money, how to manage it well, how to be curious, and how to ask questions.
You give a lot of beautiful examples in your book about how to do that as a family with the children, which I think is absolutely beautiful. But my question was, when I was reading it, if I'm a parent who hasn't got money, who has got lots of debts, how and has maybe all that shame attached to it, or that feeling of I'm not a good parent because I can't give my children what other kids have. They all go on holiday, my child can't. I can't afford the nice clothes. How much harder that conversation must be with your children.
But it is all about being honest, because just because you're not having the conversation doesn't mean your children don't know what is going on
That's
and are
true.
not making assumptions and making worst assumptions with regards to what is going on. So it's really important to actually, summer holidays, well, we're recording this during the summer holidays. It's an expensive time for parents because, the children are off school for 6 weeks rather than having school lunches. They're having all three meals at home. They're wanting to go out, they're wanting to do things, they're bored. It's the ideal time to have the conversation with them. Right, the 6 weeks of the holiday, it's going to be lovely spending this time with you. However, it's also an expensive time. So let's work out what the priorities are, what we can do, what we may not be able to do, and how we're going to go about creating the opportunities that we want. Because if we're not having those conversations, it could well be that that child is, we haven't got much money. I see mum getting really stressed when brown envelopes come through the door. So I'm not going to ask for anything. I'm not going to ask to go out with my friends. I'm just going to lock myself up in my bedroom, and I'm going to just wait for the holidays to go by. When the reality might be you can afford to do some things, you just need to
Mm.
budget accordingly or have the conversation, right at the start of the year. Right, the summer holidays are 6 months away. What would you like to be doing in the summer holidays? Let's work out a plan for doing that. That's far more honest than pretending everything is okay, because your child will know everything is not okay. They're just choosing to internalize it. And what happens when they choose to internalize it? That is when they become fearful. That's when they have a scarcity approach to money, and they see money as something to be afraid of, rather than let's be honest, let's talk about what we want, let's create a plan. Not everything can be on that plan, but we can do certain things. And that is the approach that I really think will resonate with every child and every parent. Pretending everything's okay is not going to solve anything. Having an honest conversation about we can't, that's not in the budget right now. So you don't have to even say we can't afford to do that. That's not in the budget right now, but what can we do to work towards it? Because in life, that's exactly how they are going to have to approach things if they want to be successful with money going forward. Start having that conversation now, because that child will feel far more confident that they know what is going on than coming to their own conclusions anyway.
You're so right. And I've got a good example of that. So, although it's many years ago, but when I was little, my mum was the person post-war. She was like, if you have to buy something, go to the cheapest shop and buy it there. And my father was the opposite. In those days, it was true. He said, buy the most expensive because it's the best quality, which is not anymore nowadays, but in those days it was. So for me, as a child, it was like, oh my God, I had such extreme opinions on money, which was hard. And of course, I found my father's opinion much more interesting than my mum's. But my brother actually thought we had no food for the next day because my mum made it feel like we were so poor, there was nothing there. And now, well, after years after we found out they had a lot of money, it's just the way my mum was talking about it made him feel so worried that we didn't have anything to eat, which
Yeah,
is a horrible thing to think as a child, to
yeah,
worry about
exactly.
that unnecessarily.
Yeah,
And I
and
love
that's
how
exactly
you,
it.
from a brain point of view, yeah, I totally agree. I don't like the idea of saying we can't afford it, but maybe the idea, if we really want it, how can we make it happen? So we open up to the possibility and we work on something and we don't close it down because I think that can be really hard for children to hear that.
Exactly. You create a plan and you encourage your children to be solution focused because that is what we want. We want when a problem is presented, we want them to go, okay, so this is the problem. How can we solve that problem? What's more important right now to help us to solve that problem? Or actually, is it even a problem? Do we really want that? Or are we saying we want that brand new pair of trainers because John next door has a brand new pair of trainers? Or actually, would going to Thorpe Park in the same trainers you're wearing right now that fit you perfectly well, but you've always wanted to go to Thorpe Park? Which do you want the most? Because once your child starts to realize you're trusting them with a choice and having a conversation about that choice, well, then they realize, well, yeah, you're right, Mum, actually, these trainers, they fit me perfectly. They're really, really comfortable. And actually, I've always wanted to go to Thorpe Park. I can wait for the new trainers. So it is about having those conversations where they feel included and you describe that really well there. They feel safe because that is what we want our children to feel around money is safe. And I suspect your brother in that moment didn't feel safe. He worried there wouldn't be food the next day. And we don't want our children to feel unsafe. These conversations are not about, getting your bank statement and saying to them, look how overdrawn I am. Oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to pay the next bill because you are the adult. They are the child. But it's about having conversations where they feel they can ask questions, where you will be honest with them, and that they can then create an environment where they start to be part of that solution.
That's beautiful. And also I think it's appreciation, isn't it? Because it's so easy nowadays because everything, like you touched on earlier, it's the gaming world, for example, it's so built up to make them draw in and take the money, everything. The way the cosmetics world is made makes us, especially girls, feel like we're never good enough, we don't smell good enough, we don't look good enough, so we have spent so much money. So there's such an emotional connotation to money, and that used to be one of the things when I wasn't feeling great as a young adult and was quite lost and had a bit of anxiety and depression. Money was my thing to make myself feel better
Yeah,
every month. Although I didn't have it, but I spent it. That was kind of my go-to for me to feel better, and that's a really dangerous route to go down, isn't it? So it's that
absolutely.
appreciation as well. If I, like you say, if I know that I will go to Thorpe Park, but it's a special event that we build up to and eventually we go to, rather than in this world where everything's by a click of a button, we don't really appreciate anymore,
Yeah,
but we
I
get it.
agree.
I think that's really missing as well.
Yeah, exactly. And, in years to come, it's far more likely that your child, when you have the conversation, do you remember when you were 14, we all went to Thorpe Park and I wouldn't go on that scary roller coaster, but you went on and you left. Oh, yeah, I really remember that, Mum. They're not going to remember those trainers,
No,
because you don't
totally.
remember those things. And I think it is about having the conversations and making people feel they are part of family decisions, because that's when cohesion happens. That is when trust is built. And that is when the whole the whole circle, around money, that all the beliefs that we had that we recognize are holding us back, when we think about those, because no parent wants to hand, limiting beliefs around money on to their children. So we need to think about, well, what are my limiting beliefs saying, about me? Am I only giving my children things at birthdays and Christmas? That might be because I can only afford to give them things at birthdays and Christmas. That is fine. Or am I actually, when they're saying, I want to go to that concert, are we saying, well, I'm really sorry, but it's not your birthday for 6 months, so you can't go? Are we saying that simply because when we were growing up, we only had big things, birthdays and Christmas? But if we could afford to send, to give our child that ticket to go to that concert, but we're holding back because we have a belief that you only get special things at Christmas and birthdays, is to actually think, do I want them to only think they can go to a concert at their birthday or Christmas? Or I've had a bonus, or I've had, I've been saving, and I've been saving for these special occasions because we know that's going to have a big impact. What, so you mean I can go to that con? Yeah, of course you can. You've worked hard at school, you've been really good at keeping up with your chores at home. Yeah, absolutely, you can go. So we need to think about when we're saying yes, when we're saying no, why and how. And I think once we start being far more conscious about this, about the decisions we're making and the language that we're using, then that gives us the ability to have that open conversation. Because again, if our child comes to us and says, I really want to go to that concert, it might be a case of you can't afford it at that point in time. And you say to them, well, I would really love for you to be able to go, but actually, right now, it's not in the budget. But how about we get you that ticket for your birthday?
Yeah.
And then they can decide, well, yeah, but it's not my birthday for 6 months. Do I really want to have my present 6 months earlier? Do I really want to go to that concert? I'm not sure. So it gets them then thinking as well about their priorities and how important it is.
Yeah, and I think up to now it's always felt like it's been handled like it's an adult subject, but it's not because kids are much earlier in contact with money than they used to be as well. But if you go to the other side, you talked about it earlier for a short moment for people who are very wealthy. I remember reading a book by a coach who coaches people with families with massive wealth, and he was saying if they're emotionally same thing, if they're emotionally not prepared for the wealth that they're getting, these children, there is so much addiction and so much problems because again there has not been a conversation about how to handle money and how to deal with it.
Yeah. And very often people make an assumption. The only people who have challenges with money are those who don't have money, when that is simply, not the case. When you are brought up with wealth, that can make you feel very, very unworthy if you feel as though I'm never going to be as successful as my parents, or your parents have a very high bar when it comes to you as the child because you're in an expensive private school, for example, and you're not producing the results that they see as the quid pro quo. You go to this expensive school, I expect you to have, very, very high results. And the sense of self-worth and self-value that comes from ensuring that you're in an environment where your dad has a Lamborghini, but your best friend's father has three whatever else top of the range cars, and that comparison in the book, The Psychology of Money, um the Morgan, I can't remember his surname now, he talks about, and this is a really, really good example, he talks about the baseball player who earns $10 million a year, who is not satisfied because he compares himself to the heavyweight boxer who earns $15 million a year, who's also not satisfied because he doesn't earn as much as the baseball player who earns $25 million a year. So if you're always comparing yourself to somebody else, you're never ever going to have that same sense of self-worth for what you've created. You're always looking over the garden wall into somebody else's garden and comparing how beautiful theirs is compared to yours. So you're more concerned about their garden than you are about your own garden. And when you have, a lot of money, it can come at the exchange of not having your parents' time. It can come that mean that, your father or your mother or both are away a lot of the time, or you're taken away from your friends because you're always traveling during school holidays. You might be an only child and you're with adults the entire time, not having the opportunity to spend time, with your younger friends. So believing that one situation is better than another, again, in the presentations I've given, I've spoken about, very successful people who have had a lot of money and then have lost it. So Sven-Göran Eriksson, the Swedish football manager who managed England for a number of years. He was asked several years ago, "Do you know what you're worth?" And he said, "I have no idea what I'm worth. I have no idea where my money is. I leave that all to my finance manager." It was discovered years later his finance manager was swindling him out of millions to the point that when he died, he was actually left with next, or his next of kin was left with next to no money because he had been swindled, because he had basically passed all responsibility for his money to somebody else. Because he had no
Mm.
regard for money. And that very often happens to very wealthy people. They don't, and not just very wealthy people, it can also happen at the end of the scale, but they don't have that same value for money. They pass responsibility over to somebody else, and then decisions get made on their behalf that don't serve them. So we do have to be very, very careful with regards to how we are talking to our children about money, just as important as when we have a lot of money than when we don't have enough money. Because if we are wealthy as parents, but we're not talking to our children about budgeting, saving, investing, retiring, etc., then they can believe that money is something they're always going to have access to until a point comes when that parent might say, "Well, you're 21 now. That's it. Really sorry, but you've got to find your own way in the world. I had to make my own money, and now it's up to you." And when that happens, if we haven't brought that child up to have the skills around creating, generating, managing money, then we wonder why they get into problems. And I think that is something that is not talked about enough as well.
Yeah, and I remember reading in the book that in those wealth families, often the ones doing the best are the ones who live in fairly normal areas and not in the really rich areas, so
Yeah.
in fairly normal areas. Because otherwise, the pressure on these kids sometimes is so enormous to be the best and, to be top notch all
Yeah.
the time that then leads to other problems.
And it's that sense of comparatinitis, isn't
Yeah.
it? And again, the psychology of money
Mhm.
describes that, really well. If you were always looking to somebody else and what they're achieving and comparing it with your achievements, then you are never appreciating how well you have done. And there's always going to be people around you that will do better than you. There'll always be people around you who don't do as well as you. But if you're constantly looking over the wall into somebody else's garden and not appreciating your own garden, then that's always going to leave you with a feeling of lack and dissatisfaction. And that is when your life, loses real meaning and real joy because you're no longer doing it for you, you're doing it because you're comparing yourself to somebody else.
And we're always comparing up, we're never comparing down, are we? You think
Absolutely.
how many people would be willing to change their life any moment with you.
Exactly.
Is there anything you give us on? So we grow up, and it's still happening with this idea or manipulation, we could call it, on TV, that often the rich people are the baddies in films.
Yeah.
So I sometimes think it's like, is that a coincidence? I mean, no, we're made to think like that, so we don't want to have much money. Um, how can we get away from the idea that money means we turn into a bad person? And how can we go into the idea that, okay, if I had money, I can do really good things with it, but without the pressure that we have to be, the good person rescue in the world, because I don't like it either when it's too much. We have to go and be good.
Well, it's interesting because usually in American films, the baddies are rich and English or British or British. And I always find that really interesting that the baddies are usually going to be, a British character.
Interesting.
Um, I think, and again, I mention this in the book, there is the phrase, money is the root of all evil, when actually that is not the phrase at all. That's how we have become to know it, but actually it's for the love of money. is the root of all evil. So, and what that essentially means is if you are just fixated on making money and making more money and showing off and being seen, as the best, and you look down on other people who don't have as much money as you because you're looking down on them, but you're envious of those who you consider to have more than you, then you get yourself into this doom loop. There are plenty of examples of people, for example, yesterday I read about the richest billionaire you've probably never heard of. And there is a guy who is exactly the same age as me, and he is worth 14 billion pounds. And I have never heard of him. Now, he has built his wealth up through having, a hedge fund, etc., but he takes his privacy very, very seriously. He's never flaunted his wealth, he's never sought publicity, etc. When you look out into the world, there will be lots of people who have a lot of money and do a lot of good with it. There'll be a lot of people who have a lot of money and do bad with it. There'll be a lot of people who don't have very much money and do bad things too. So just by simply saying, well, because you've got money, you're going to behave in this way, then you have to look at it the same in reverse. So you haven't got money, so you're going to behave in this way. When it's simply not true. It comes down to what is the story you are telling yourself? Why are you telling yourself that somebody with a lot of money, first of all, what is a lot of money, to Ethiopia in the 1980s, was it 1990s, when the famine was happening, around Live Aid, 1987, I think it was, around Live Aid, the famine, etc., starving children. Well, they would have viewed a lot of money very differently to what we view as a lot of money. So a lot of money comes down to people's perception of it. Wealth comes down to people's perception of it. Why do you automatically, as a person, why would you automatically view somebody who has a lot of money as being a bad person? You would only do that if that was a limiting belief that allowed you to be satisfied or allowed you to believe you were satisfied. I don't want to be rich because it would mean I was a bad person. Why? The more money you have, the more people you can help. The more money you have, the more tax you are likely to pay, and therefore, indirectly, the more people you are going to help. So if your limiting belief is holding you in a position that just suits your narrative, ask yourself, is that a narrative you're happy with? Or actually, do I want to go out and have a different narrative and actually prove that belief to be limiting and not one that is allowing me to move forward positively? Because normally when we say people are, it's usually an excuse because there isn't a group of people who all behave badly or a group of people who
Mm.
all behave well. It's an amalgamation, and we have to decide what are the behaviors, what are the beliefs that are serving us, that are allowing us to move our lives forward and our family's life forward in the way that we want to, rather than adopting a philosophy because it suits our narrative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's very interesting. I read something interesting. Can't remember which book that was, but that in the normal schools, like public, oh yeah, it was confusing with public in private
State
schools.
schools in the UK.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that in normal schools, kids were taught maths like you have five bananas and two apples, and then you give away one banana and one apple. What have you got left? But that in the private schools, kids will be asked, you own five buildings and you have four cars, and you sell one building and you sell one car. What have you got left? So that already the way we're being taught can be so different in the way we think that, do you see the difference there?
And that is a limiting belief. And I'll tell you why. My children both went to private school, and my youngest is still at private school. That's not how he was taught. They were taught maths at all. They were taught maths in the same traditional way. So I think that is something that in a narrative that has built up
Okay, interesting.
basically to
Yeah,
say this is how one, they teach in one school, this is no, different schools will teach it, in different ways. But actually, in private schools, you do have, the whole gamut of very, very rich, and children who are there on bursaries, and children in the middle whose parents have worked really hard
yeah,
and made certain choices for their children to be at private school. And I think we like to create the narrative around what suits us to a certain extent. And I think it's really important to question that narrative, because I firmly believe everybody should be encouraged to create the kinds of life that they want to create without having somebody holding them back because you can't do that because it's never done, been done before. You can't go to university because nobody in our family has gone to university. There always has to be a first. You look at lots of the most successful entrepreneurs. They've actually come from families who didn't have anything, but they had the belief, the
yeah,
spark that they could create success. And that for me is what schools should be teaching far more than facts. Because
yeah,
facts you can learn, particularly nowadays, facts you can learn anywhere. What you cannot learn to believe you can be successful. You have to create that environment in which you believe you can be successful. Because as Henry Ford said, whether you believe you can or you can't,
yeah.
you're right. And the other one that I absolutely love is if you fight for your limitations, you get to keep them.
Oh,
And
that's a good one.
anybody that is listening to this podcast,
Mm.
and says, well, it's okay for her because listen to what that next thought is going to be. It's okay for her because I was brought up by a mum who would not allow me to limit myself. I could have ended up doing just two A levels, and my mum said, nope, you're doing three. I could have ended up going to college, not going to university, because I believed I was only ever going to go to college. My mum, nope, you're going to go to university. So I was limiting myself from a very, very young age as far as my full potential was concerned. And my mother wouldn't allow me to limit myself. Now I place no limits on myself whatsoever. I still have lots of things, I want to achieve. But the minute we set our bar here is the minute that we never push past that bar,
Yeah,
basically. And
wonderful.
that is the message essentially of my book. I want us to create a generation that believes it is possible for them and they find a way to make it possible rather than accepting the limitations that are put on them by society, by government decisions, by other third parties. Because for every example you give me of somebody who hasn't succeeded, I can give you an example of somebody who has. And success is based on your own measurement of success. Not everybody wants to be millionaires. Not everybody wants to be an owner of a business. Not everybody wants to have the kinds of success that they read about in magazines and newspapers, on podcasts, etc. But understand what is your true benchmark of success and how are you going to get there and how are you going to encourage your children to get there? Because it is possible if you believe it's possible.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. It's so opening, isn't it? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is it to also be good what we have, but also not, yeah, not to relate everything to the numbers, isn't
I
it?
agree. Yeah, absolutely.
To the
Yeah.
self-worth and self-motivation for me is a really, really big one with young people, because that's kind of, they get so lost and get overwhelmed to be pushed into areas that they might not want to go. They have to be pushed into schools, or they have to be the mini copy of their parents. And it's hard as a parent nowadays because there's so much out there. But like you, my biggest slogan is that be the loudest voice in your child's head, because there's so much competition out there trying to shape what they're going to think.
I
And
love that.
if we want to have an influence, we need to be loud and
Yeah,
clear and have these conversations.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
your book is absolutely amazing for that.
Thank you.
So where else can people find you?
Well, the easiest place is my website, which is the moneyconfidenceacademy.com, because on there is all links to all my social media. On Instagram, I am underscore Lesley Thomas. On LinkedIn, I am Lesley Thomas. My podcast is called Let's Talk Money and More. My book is called Parents, Let's Talk Money. So I'm everything about money. But if you go to my website, the moneyconfidenceacademy.com, all my socials, all my links, the podcast, everything is there.
And you have courses as well, is that right?
Yes, that's right. So I have one-to-one coaching. I have a course for teenagers, which is called Money at Home. I have a course for schools called Money at School. I have a brand new program that's coming out later on this year, which is to help parents to have those conversations with their teenagers, starting with working on their own relationship with money, because that is the purpose, of the book. It is for you to understand your relationship with money, so you can help your teenager to understand their relationship with money, because they will have a relationship with money already, courtesy of you.
Yes, yes. Oh, fantastic. Oh my God, this has been so amazing. And I can't wait to listen to all the rest of your 203 podcasts, because they're just absolutely amazing and inspiring. And it's such an important subject. And I'm a bit jealous that we're not in the same area, because otherwise I'll get you into my kids' school to do a talk. But
Ah,
thank you so much, Leslie. That was absolutely amazing.
thank you. I loved our conversation as well, Veronique. Thank you for inviting me on.
Bye for now.
Right.